Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we uncover the deeply human tales that touch hearts and inspire change. Today, we bring you the powerful story of the Parker family, a family vacation that turned into a fight for justice against prejudice and discrimination. Stay tuned for this unforgettable journey of courage, resilience, and love. The Harris family had planned this vacation meticulously, eager for a reprieve from their demanding lives in Washington, D.C. David Harris, a distinguished FBI agent known for his unshakable demeanor in the face of danger, often spent weeks away from home, chasing leads and handling high-stakes cases. His work demanded every ounce of his focus. But the cost was clear. His wife Rebecca and their two children, Jacob and Sophie, rarely saw him fully present. This vacation was meant to change that. For once, he promised to leave the weight of his badge behind and focus solely on his family. Rebecca Harris was a force of nature in her own right, a civil rights attorney with a passion for justice. She spent her days fighting battles for underserved communities, standing firm in courtrooms against systems that perpetuated inequality. Her work had earned her respect and accolades, but it also took its toll. She carried the stories of her clients home with her, their pain lingering long after the verdicts were read. This vacation was as much for her as it was for David, a chance to reconnect, to step away from the constant grind of their lives and find solace in the simplicity of family. Their destination was a stunning resort in Miami, a sprawling paradise where the azure waves kissed golden sands. Palm trees lined the paths to luxurious suites, and the air was filled with the scent of salt water and blooming hibiscus. For the Harris children, it was a dream come true. 12-year-old Jacob, with his lanky build and boundless energy, had plans to spend every waking moment in the pool. Sophie, his 7-year-old sister, was enchanted by the promise of building sandcastles and collecting seashells. Her curly hair bounced as she ran ahead, her radiant smile reflecting the innocence of a child who believed the world was a kind and fair place. David reclined by the pool, sunglasses shielding his eyes from the bright Miami sun. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to relax. The taste of a cold drink lingered on his lips, and the sound of Sophie's laughter filled his ears. Rebecca sat next to him, her nose buried in a novel she had been trying to finish for weeks. She looked serene, though David knew her well enough to see the subtle signs of weariness. He reached over, briefly brushing her hand. She smiled at him, a shared understanding passing between them. They both needed this. Time to breathe. Time to heal. The day unfolded lazily, the kind of day they had dreamed of when they booked the trip. Jacob challenged Sophie to a race across the pool, his competitive streak on full display. Sophie, undeterred, splashed and laughed, her joyous squeals drawing smiles from other guests lounging nearby. David watched them, a rare sense of peace settling over him. These were the moments he cherished most, the moments he had missed too many of while chasing criminals and protecting his country. But beneath the surface, Rebecca felt a familiar unease creeping in. She had experienced enough of the world to know that not everyone viewed families like theirs with open arms. They had encountered it before, the sideways glances, the assumptions, the questions that lingered just a little too long. Still, she reminded herself that this was their time, a safe haven where they could simply be a family without judgment. It wasn't long before her instincts were proven right. David noticed the security guard approaching first. The man, dressed in a dark polo shirt with the resort's emblem, exuded authority as he strode purposefully toward them. His expression was polite, but there was a stiffness in his demeanor, a wariness that set David's instincts on edge. He sat up slowly, lowering his sunglasses as the guard stopped in front of their loungers. "Excuse me, sir," the guard began, his voice firm but measured. "I need to verify that you're a guest here." David's eyebrows raised slightly, but he kept his voice calm. "I am a guest here," he replied evenly. "We're staying in room 305. Rebecca glanced up from her book, her sharp mind already piecing together the situation. She had seen this play out too many times before, and the familiar ache of frustration stirred in her chest. David's calm demeanor was one of his greatest strengths, but she could see the tension in his jaw as he spoke. The guard nodded, his expression unchanged. I'll need to confirm that with the front desk. It's just procedure. David's lips tightened, but he gave a small nod. Go ahead. Rebecca put down her book, her gaze now fixed on the guard. Is there a problem? She asked, her voice polite but firm. The guard hesitated for a moment, as though weighing his words. No problem, ma'am. Just a routine check. Rebecca exchanged a glance with David, her frustration simmering beneath the surface. She recognized the code in the guard's words. This wasn't routine, and they both knew it. As the guard walked away, David leaned toward Rebecca. Let them check, he said softly, though his voice carried the weight of exhaustion. It's not worth escalating. Rebecca nodded, though she couldn't hide the spark of anger in her eyes. This was supposed to be their time, their escape. And now the familiar sting of prejudice threatened to unravel the fragile peace they had worked so hard to create. The children returned to their loungers, their laughter fading as they sensed the shift in the atmosphere. Jacob looked at his parents, his brow furrowed in confusion. Is something wrong? He asked, his voice tentative. Rebecca forced a smile, brushing a hand through his hair. Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just a little misunderstanding. But even as she spoke the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that their idyllic getaway was slipping away, the weight of the world seeping back in through the cracks. David Harris leaned back in his lounger, forcing himself to exhale slowly as the security guard retreated toward the front desk. He could feel Rebecca's simmering frustration beside him, her fingers gripping the book she had just set aside. He knew that look well. It was the same one she wore in court when facing an opponent who underestimated her. He reached for her hand, a silent reminder to stay calm. But the tension between them and the situation was palpable. Rebecca shifted her gaze to the children, who were still playing but noticeably quieter. Sophie had resumed building a small tower of pool toys on the shallow end, her earlier giggles replaced by a wary focus. Jacob stayed close to her, casting furtive glances back toward his parents. David could see the unspoken questions in their eyes, and it tore at him. He wanted to shield them from moments like this, to preserve their innocence for just a little while longer. Rebecca broke the silence. You know this isn't just a misunderstanding. David. He nodded, not meeting her eyes. I know, he said quietly, but let's not make this worse. Let them do what they think they need to do. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. David knew her well enough to see that she was already strategizing, preparing for a fight if it came to that. Rebecca had spent years fighting for justice in a world that often seemed to reject it. But when it came to her family, her fire burned brighter, fiercer. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. David sipped his drink, keeping his composure as best he could. Rebecca kept her book open, but didn't read, her eyes scanning the pool area with precision, taking in every detail. She noted how the other guests were beginning to watch, their conversations growing quieter as whispers rippled through the crowd. When the security guard returned, he wasn't alone. A second guard walked beside him, his posture stiff, his expression less polite than the first. David felt a knot tighten in his stomach as the two approached. Rebecca stood up immediately, her movements sharp and deliberate, like a chess player preparing to make her first move. Sir, the first guard began, his voice less measured this time. We're going to need you and your family to leave the pool area until we can confirm your information with the front desk. David stood, his full height commanding attention, though his tone remained steady. I've already told you, we're staying in room 305. There's no need to ask us to leave. You can confirm with the front desk. The second guard stepped forward, his arms crossed over his chest. We've had issues with non-guests using the pool. This is just protocol. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. Protocol? Her voice was sharp now, cutting through the air like glass. Tell me, is this protocol applied to every family here, or just ours? The second guard flinched, but his stance remained defiant. Ma'am, we're just doing our job. Rebecca crossed her arms, her expression unwavering. Your job? Your job is to harass paying guests? To interrogate families enjoying a day by the pool? If this is your job, I think the management here needs to reconsider its hiring practices. David placed a calming hand on her shoulder. Rebecca, he said softly, though he couldn't mask the weariness in his voice. Let's not escalate this. Rebecca glanced at him, her fire tempered, but not extinguished. They're the ones escalating. David. The guards exchanged a look before the second one smirked slightly. Look, if you have an issue with how we're handling this, you could take it up with management. Rebecca stepped closer, her tone low but fierce. Oh, don't worry. I intend to. At that moment, Jacob and Sophie walked up, their curiosity and concern evident. Jacob looked up at his father, his voice small but resolute. Dad, are we in trouble? David knelt down, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. No, Jacob, it's just a misunderstanding. Go back and play with your sister. Okay. Jacob hesitated, his eyes searching his father's face for reassurance, then nodded reluctantly. He took Sophie's hand and led her back to the shallow end. But David could see the confusion lingering in his son's eyes. It broke him in ways he couldn't express. As the guards turned to walk away, a new wave of unease washed over the family. Within minutes, they returned, not with confirmation from the front desk, but with two uniformed police officers. Rebecca's jaw tightened visibly as she watched the officers approach. David felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but forced himself to remain calm. This was a delicate line they were walking now. The taller of the two officers stepped forward, his expression unreadable. We received a report of an incident here, he said, his voice clipped. I'll need to see some identification. David stood straight, meeting the officer's gaze without hesitation. I've already explained to the security guards. My family and I are guests here. We're staying in room 305. My name is David Harris, and I'm an FBI agent. The officer raised an eyebrow, but didn't flinch. I'm going to need to see some ID. David reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. He retrieved his wallet and presented his badge and ID. Here's my identification, he said calmly. The officer took the badge, examining it briefly before handing it back with a skeptical expression. We'll need more than this. Rebecca stepped forward, her voice icy. He's shown you his FBI credentials. What more do you need? The officer didn't answer, his focus remaining on David. Sir, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to follow procedure. David clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. I've cooperated. I've shown you my credentials, and I've answered your questions. There's nothing else to provide. The second officer, younger and clearly eager to assert himself, stepped forward. Put your hands behind your back. David froze, disbelief flashing across his face. Rebecca stepped in front of him, her voice rising. Are you seriously about to handcuff a federal agent in front of his children? Do you have any idea what you're doing? The younger officer didn't flinch. Ma'am, step back. This is protocol. David's voice, steady but filled with quiet resolve, broke through. Rebecca, it's okay. No, it's not okay, she snapped, her voice trembling with restrained fury. This is wrong. David. David met her gaze, his eyes filled with both anger and sorrow. Let me handle this. As the officers closed in, Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest. The world seemed to blur as she watched them reach for her husband, the man who had spent his life protecting others, now being treated like a criminal. Her children's laughter from earlier echoed faintly in her mind, replaced by Sophie's choked sobs and Jacob's quiet, stunned silence. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was an injustice that would change everything. As the cold metal cuffs snapped onto David Harris's wrists, a heavy silence fell over the pool area. The chatter of onlookers ceased, replaced by a tense, disbelieving quiet. Rebecca's heart sank as she watched her husband, a man who had spent years serving his country, treated as though he were a threat. Sophie's sobs broke through the stillness, her tiny hands gripping Rebecca's leg with a desperation that mirrored her own. Mommy, why are they doing this to Daddy? Sophie cried, her voice trembling with fear. Rebecca knelt, gathering her daughter into her arms. It's okay. Sweetheart, she whispered, though her own voice was unsteady. Daddy hasn't done anything wrong. We're going to fix this. Jacob stood nearby, his face pale and rigid. His confusion was quickly morphing into something darker, a simmering anger. Why? Mom, he asked, his voice low but firm. Why are they treating him like this? He's an FBI agent. He protects people. Rebecca wanted to answer, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain something so deeply unfair? How could she help her children understand the prejudice that had invaded their peaceful vacation? David turned slightly, his hands cuffed behind him, and spoke softly. It's going to be okay. Jacob, take care of your sister. Listen to your mom. His voice was calm, but Rebecca could see the tension in his jaw, the subtle clenching of his hands. She knew he was holding back a torrent of emotions, unwilling to let their children see his pain. The younger officer who had cuffed David took a step back, his face a mask of defiance. The older officer, clearly more experienced, glanced nervously at the growing crowd of spectators. Phones were raised, their screens capturing every moment. Whispered comments rippled through the guests, and the tension grew thick enough to cut. Rebecca stood, her arms still wrapped protectively around Sophie, and faced the officers. Her voice, though strained, was sharp and commanding. You've made a grave mistake, she said, her gaze fixed on the younger officer. Do you have any idea who you just handcuffed? This man has spent his life protecting people like you. The younger officer sneered. Ma'am, step back. This isn't your concern. Rebecca's fury ignited. My husband is being humiliated in front of my children for no reason. Don't you dare tell me it's not my concern. She took a step closer, her sharp tone cutting through the officer's bravado. You've already crossed a line, and believe me, I will make sure you answer for it. The older officer cleared his throat, stepping between Rebecca and his colleague. Ma'am, let's all calm down, he said, attempting to de-escalate the situation. We're just following procedure. Rebecca shot back. What procedure allows you to handcuff a man without evidence, without justification, in front of his family? What crime has he committed other than daring to exist in this resort? David interjected, his voice steady but firm. Rebecca, that's enough. Let's not make this worse. She turned to him, her eyes blazing. Worse? David, look at what they're doing to you. Look at what our children are seeing. How can it possibly get worse than this? David held her gaze, his expression a mixture of resolve and heartbreak. Because if we escalate this, it could get dangerous for all of us. Let me handle it. Rebecca clenched her fists, her body trembling with restrained anger. She hated this, hated the helplessness she felt, hated the message this moment was sending to her children, that even their father, a man of integrity and service, could be reduced to this. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, emboldened by the unfolding drama. A man in a Hawaiian shirt stepped forward, his phone raised. What are you doing? He called out, his voice filled with indignation. You can't just arrest him without cause. Step back. Sir, the younger officer barked, his authority wavering. The man didn't budge. You're going to regret this, he warned. You're being recorded, and the world is going to see how you're treating this family. Rebecca felt a flicker of gratitude for the stranger's support, but her focus remained on her husband. She watched as the younger officer tightened his grip on David's arm, pulling him toward the resort's entrance. Wait! Rebecca's voice rang out, stopping them in their tracks. If you take him, my children and I are coming with you. Ma'am, that's not how this works, the older officer said, his tone strained. Rebecca lifted her chin defiantly. Then you'd better figure out how to make it work. Because I'm not leaving my husband's side, and I'm not letting you separate our family. David sighed, a mixture of pride and frustration in his expression. Rebecca, please, stay with the kids. They need you. No, she said firmly. They need us. Both of us. Together. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the situation finally settling over them. The younger officer seemed ready to argue, but the older one raised a hand, silencing him. Fine, he said reluctantly, but stay back and don't interfere. Rebecca nodded, her grip on Sophie tightening. "We'll see about that," she muttered under her breath. As the group began to move, Rebecca cast a quick glance at Jacob, silently urging him to stay calm. He gave her a small nod, his jaw set with determination. Sophie clung to her hand, her wide eyes filled with fear. Rebecca's heart ached as she realized the lasting impact this moment would have on her children. But her resolve only hardened. This was far from over. They might have cuffed her husband and disrupted their vacation, but they had underestimated one critical thing: her family's strength. And Rebecca Harris wasn't going to let this injustice go unanswered. The Harris family, flanked by the officers, entered the resort's grand lobby, a place designed to exude luxury, but now tinged with tension and injustice. Rebecca held Sophie close, her hand firmly grasping Jacob's. David walked calmly despite the cuffs, his FBI training evident in his composure. But his mind raced, weighing every word, every action, as if navigating a battlefield. The lobby fell silent as guests turned to witness the commotion. Behind them, the crowd from the pool had followed, their murmurs growing louder. Phones were raised, capturing the scene. The Harris family, now the unwilling center of a brewing storm. The resort manager, a tall man in a crisp navy suit, hurried forward, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. "What's going on here?" he demanded, addressing the officers. The older officer stepped forward, speaking in a low, measured tone. "We were called to investigate a disturbance. We've detained this man until we can verify his identity and confirm he is a guest." The manager's brow furrowed. "Disturbance?" He glanced at the Harris family, his gaze briefly meeting Rebecca's fiery stare before landing on David. "Is this true? Are you not guests here?" David spoke calmly, his voice steady despite the rising anger beneath the surface. "My name is David Harris. My family and I checked into room 407 yesterday. You can verify that with your front desk staff." The manager hesitated, looking to the officers for confirmation. Rebecca seized the moment, stepping forward. "This is a disgrace," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You've humiliated my husband, frightened our children, and disrupted our vacation, all because you assumed we didn't belong here. Now, I suggest you check your records immediately." The manager turned to the receptionist, who was already typing furiously into her computer. A moment later, she looked up, her face pale. "Yes, Mr. Harris and his family are registered guests in room 407. Rebecca crossed her arms, her gaze hard as steel as she turned back to the officers. "There, now release my husband." The older officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "We still need to verify." "Enough," a commanding voice interrupted. All eyes turned as a man in a sharp gray suit strode into the room. Deputy Chief James Landry, a respected figure in the local police department, exuded authority. His piercing blue eyes scanned the scene, taking in the officers, the Harris family, and the crowd. "Deputy Chief Landry," the older officer began, but Landry held up a hand to silence him. "I've been briefed," Landry said. He turned to David, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Harris, I understand you're an FBI agent. May I see your badge?" Dalit Nodet, motioning with his cuffed hands. Rebecca quickly stepped forward, retrieving his badge from his pocket and handing it to Landry. The deputy chief examined it carefully before handing it back. "This badge is genuine. Release him immediately." The younger officer hesitated, his defiance faltering. "But, sir," I said. "Release him," Landry barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officer reluctantly removed the cuffs. David rubbed his wrists, his calm demeanor never faltering, though Rebecca could see the tightness in his jaw. "On behalf of the department, I apologize for this incident," Landry said, addressing David directly. "Yes, you. There will be a full investigation into the conduct of these officers." Rebecca stepped forward, her voice sharp. "An apology isn't enough. These men humiliated my husband and traumatized our children. This isn't just about one incident. This is about systemic prejudice, and we won't let it be swept under the rug." Landry met her gaze, his expression serious. Mrs. Harris, I understand your frustration. And yes, you. This matter will be addressed. If you'd like, you can file a formal complaint, and I will personally oversee the investigation. Rebecca crossed her arms, her skepticism evident. Oh, we'll file a complaint, she said. But don't think for a second that this will end with a simple investigation. We're going to make sure everyone knows what happened here. David placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of support. We appreciate your apology. Deputy Chief, he said evenly. But like my wife said, this isn't over. Landry nodded, his face grave. Understood. The tension in the room began to dissipate as the officers retreated. Their heads lowered. The crowd, emboldened by the Harris family's courage, began to cheer and applaud. A woman stepped forward, her phone still recording. Thank you for standing up to them, she said. What they did was wrong, and people need to see this. Rebecca managed a small smile, though the weight of the incident still pressed heavily on her. We're not just standing up for ourselves, she said. We're standing up for everyone who's ever been treated this way. As the crowd dispersed, the resort manager approached cautiously. Mr. and Mrs. Harris, I deeply apologize for this incident. Your stay will be fully comped, and we'll be implementing new training for our staff to ensure this never happens again. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. Training won't erase what happened, she said, but it's a start. David glanced at the manager, his expression unreadable. Let's hope it's more than just words. As the family walked back toward their room, the weight of the ordeal began to lift, replaced by a quiet determination. David placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Are you okay, Dad? Jacob asked, his voice tinged with worry. Dalid know that. I'm okay. Enti promise. We're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Rebecca smiled, her eyes meeting David's. Together, she said firmly. We'll do it together. Though the day had been filled with pain and humiliation, the Harris family walked away stronger, their unity unshaken. They knew the fight for justice was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever lay ahead, together. The Parker family returned home from their vacation with a new resolve. Ethan and Lena knew they couldn't let the incident fade away as another example of unchecked discrimination. They owed it to their children, their community, and themselves to seek justice. However, the road ahead would not be simple. The incident had left emotional scars that would take time to heal, and the fight for accountability would demand perseverance. Ethan sat in his home office late at night, reviewing the events of the vacation in his mind. On his desk lay the written accounts he had started compiling, a timeline of the harassment they had endured, statements from onlookers, and copies of video footage that some resort guests had sent to them. Lena walked in quietly, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She placed one in front of him and took a seat across the desk, her face calm, but her eyes sharp with determination. Any progress? She asked. Ethan nodded, tapping the edge of a stack of papers. I've outlined everything from the moment that guard approached us at the pool. I've reached out to my contacts in the Bureau for advice on handling a federal complaint. What about you? Lena leaned back, taking a sip of her coffee. I've spoken to several civil rights attorneys I trust. They've agreed to help file a lawsuit against the resort and the police department. The evidence we have is strong, but we need to ensure this case doesn't get buried under bureaucracy. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Jackson stood in the doorway, his expression hesitant. Mom, Dad, can I talk to you? Ethan motioned for him to come in, pulling a chair close to the desk. Jackson sat down, looking at his parents with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. Why do people treat us differently? Why didn't anyone stop them when they handcuffed you? Dad. Ethan exchanged a glance with Lena before speaking, choosing his words carefully. Jackson, there are still people in this world who judge others based on things that don't matter, like the color of their skin. What happened to us wasn't fair, and it wasn't right, but standing up against it is how we make sure things get better. Jackson nodded slowly, absorbing his father's words. So, we're fighting back. Lena reached over, placing a reassuring hand on her son's. Yes, we are. But fighting back doesn't mean being angry or hateful. It means using the law, our voices, and the truth to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Jackson looked down, his brows furrowed in thought. I want to help. Is there anything I can do? Lena smiled, proud of her son's courage. You're already helping by being brave and understanding, Jackson. But if you want to help more, you can share your thoughts about what happened. Your perspective matters just as much as ours. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Lena filed the lawsuit with the support of a prominent civil rights firm, and Ethan worked to contact media outlets willing to cover their story. Local news picked up the case first, interviewing Ethan and Lena in their home. The footage showed Jackson and Emily playing in the background, a reminder of the impact the incident had on their family. Public reaction was swift and passionate. Social media exploded with hashtags demanding justice for the Parker family. The footage captured by onlookers went viral, sparking conversations about systemic discrimination and the need for accountability. Communities across the country rallied around the Parkers, offering support and solidarity. But not all reactions were positive. The police department involved in the incident released a statement defending their officers, claiming they had acted within protocol. The resort attempted to deflect responsibility, issuing a vague apology but denying any discriminatory intent. Both entities hired legal teams to mount a defense, and the Parkers found themselves facing a formidable opposition. One night, as Ethan was preparing for another meeting with their legal team, he paused to check on Jackson and Emily. He found them sitting together on Jackson's bed, flipping through a photo album of past family vacations. Emily looked up when he entered, her expression troubled. "Daddy," she said softly, "do you think it'll ever happen again? Will people stop being mean to us?" Ethan sat beside her, pulling both his children into a comforting embrace. "I can't promise it'll never happen again," he admitted, his voice steady. "But what I can promise is that we'll always stand up for ourselves and for others. And because of that, things will get better. It might take time, but change starts with people like us refusing to stay silent." Emily nodded, seeming reassured by her father's words. Jackson remained quiet, but Ethan could see a flicker of determination in his son's eyes. He hoped that their fight for justice would teach his children not only the importance of resilience, but also the value of courage and integrity. As the court date approached, tensions rose. The Parkers knew they were up against powerful adversaries, but they also knew they had the truth on their side. On the morning of the trial, Lena stood in front of the mirror adjusting her blazer. Ethan stepped into the room, watching her with admiration. "You're going to be incredible," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. Lena smiled, though her eyes betrayed a hint of nervousness. "I just want to make sure our story is heard. This is about more than us, Ethan. It's about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly." When they arrived at the courthouse, they were greeted by a large crowd of supporters. People held signs bearing messages of solidarity and justice, their voices echoing with chants of encouragement. The sight filled the Parkers with a renewed sense of purpose. Inside the courtroom, Lena delivered a powerful opening statement, outlining the harassment and discrimination her family had endured. Ethan testified about the events in detail, his calm demeanor belying the emotional weight of his words. They presented the video evidence, which left the courtroom in stunned silence. The footage of Ethan being handcuffed, of Lena standing defiantly against the officers, and of their children watching in fear painted a vivid picture of the injustice they had faced. Throughout the trial, the defense attempted to downplay the incident, arguing that the officers had acted within their authority and that the resort had no intention of discrimination. But Lena dismantled their arguments with precision, citing laws and precedents that left no room for doubt. In the end, the jury ruled in favor of the Parkers. The verdict was a resounding victory, awarding damages to the family and mandating changes in the policies of both the police department and the resort. The Parkers didn't care about the monetary compensation. What mattered was the message their victory sent. As they left the courthouse, Jackson turned to Ethan and Lena, his eyes shining with pride. "We did it," he said, his voice full of wonder. Ethan placed a hand on his son's shoulder. We did it together, and this is just the beginning. We've shown that standing up makes a difference. That night, as the family gathered around the dinner table, they shared a quiet sense of triumph. The fight had been hard, but it had been worth it. They knew there was still work to be done. But for now, they allowed themselves a moment of peace, knowing they had taken a stand for justice and made their voices heard. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey with the Parker family. Their story reminds us all of the importance of standing up for what is right, not just for ourselves, but for the greater good. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to Empathy Stories for more inspiring tales. Together, let's create a world filled with understanding, compassion, and justice. See you in the next story.